He's written a lot of books on the Yankees. Mantle, Garrick, DiMaggio and Mantle and everything else. He's a Harvard grad. Did a tremendous job. It's Garrick and the Babe, Their Friendship and the Feud, Triumph Books. It came out April 1st, so it's just at your bookstores now or on Amazon, and a lot of nuggets in there on Garrick and Ruth, and it's a fascinating read, and he says hello. Tony, welcome. Christopher Russo, how are you today, okay?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on, Chris.
Tony, it's great to have you. Great to have you with us. And I didn't realize that you were almost a pseudo Yankee historian. You have written a lot of Yankee books, Tony, and it's not that easy with so much written about the Yankees historically. It's not that it's hard to come up with all this new information, and you've been able to do that, at least in this book. How tricky is that when you go do research on a Yankee icon to come up with something different? How about that for a sec?
Well, thank you. A lot of this goes back to my old man. I'm a native Texan. My father grew up in Texas during the Second World War. When he came back home, it took him forever to get home because he was stuck in New York, or he wanted to be stuck in New York, watching the Yankees there without DiMaggio in the mid-'40s, and then coming home with huge DiMaggio poster and raising a Yankee. And he and I waged a long battle with my mom about let's move to New York. Where she wouldn't have it. Her family had been down in Texas since before Texas was even a state, and so or a republic. So we stuck it out in Texas, and I became a Yankee fan at a young age. And then later, I happened to meet Mantle in 1970 when I was a young reporter at the Dallas Times-Herald, an afternoon paper, and Mantle was retired and playing golf, and I was a golfer, and I called him to see if I could do a freelance piece for Golf Magazine, and it started there. I played golf with him in the early 70s. That developed into a friendship that went on until his death, and led to other things. When I came out here to Los Angeles in the late 70s to work as a columnist for the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, one of my dad's requests had been go meet DiMaggio, and I knew his best friend, Reno Barsacchini, through connections in New Orleans, and Barsacchini got me into DiMaggio. It was not as a sports writer; it was just somebody who I knew somebody who was a driver for someone who shall remain unnamed in New Orleans, and that got me in. It was the Italian thing, and that's what I'm working on right now. I'm working on a different biography of Joe DiMaggio than the ones we've seen out there in the past. It's, for lack of a better expression, it's the natural meets the Godfather, I suppose.
Wow, so DiMaggio's next. I know. Now, Garrick and Ruth, you knew Mantle, you ran into DiMaggio, so you have some first-hand accounts. No first-hand accounts of Garrick and Ruth, and we all know there's been a million books written on the both of them. You took a different perspective here with this friendship, and then, of course, the fact that they had a lot of issues later on. But where do you get the nuggets? I mean, I know you had the Ruth friend out there in L.A. who you talked to a lot, who work with them in Hollywood, but it's not that easy to generate new information. How'd you go about doing that with these two icons from yesteryear? What was the deal there?
When the Mantle book came out in 2002, Mickey Mantle, America's Prodigal Son, one of my friends was a big baseball aficionado. He was working on something called The House of David, the story of that baseball team with the long beards that played during Babe Ruth's era. He was working on that, and he says to me, your next book should be on Ruth and Garrick. He had just done like 3 months of research at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And he came back and he said, look, these guys are like Kobe and Shaq, who at that time were that Kobe and Shaq feud that broke up the Lakers, or at least broke up the Lakers' run toward maybe 2 or 3 other world championships was taking place. And he says they were as bad as Kobe and Shaq, and check it out. That was news to me, Mad Dog, because I had grown up believing that these guys and their dynasty and Murderers Row had won championship after championship. And started looking into this, and one of the things I discovered that for all the dynasty talk of that period and the Murderers Row, and that they're the greatest team in Yankee history or in baseball, they won 3 World Series championships. In 6 of the other 7 years, they didn't even win the American League pennant. So feud,
excellent point.
The story doesn't go back to the 20s. I mean, from 25 through the early 30s, they were actually friends. Ruth spent a lot of time at the Gehrig household. Gehrig he lived with his parents. He lived at the house that he bought his parents until he was married. So Ruth was spending a great deal of time there. They were friends. It doesn't appear that there was a feud that took place at that time. There were differences, but it started in the 30s. And that took the form of, originally, it was just a difference of opinion over the contract negotiations, because Ruth wanted even more money than he was getting. I mean, he was being paid more than the President of the United States, and everyone's familiar with that story about, why should you get paid more than the President? And Ruth's response, famously, was, I had a better year.
Yeah, Herbert Hoover.
And he wanted more, and he thought he could negotiate more, because by this time, Gehrig had become Lou Gehrig, and they thought, well, together we can negotiate a bigger deal, because negotiating at that time, there were not multi-year deals were unheard of. They happened with Ruth and one or two other players, but they usually negotiated from year to year. Ruth thought he could do better for both of them. Gehrig agreed, and then Ruth finds out that Gehrig has already signed a contract behind his back for exactly what the Yankees were offering. So Ruth thought, wow, you went behind my back on this. And so that was the start of it, although what really drove them apart was the feud. And this feud was the difference of opinion that the Gehrigs and the Ruths had over the treatment of Ruth's second wife, Claire, of Ruth's adopted daughter by his first wife, Helen. That little girl's name was Dorothy. And when Ruth and Claire married in 1929, Dorothy came into this household because the only reason Ruth got married was because his wife, Helen, died in a tragic fire in Massachusetts. And up until that time, although Ruth had been with Claire since the mid-20s, Claire was this Southern belle from Georgia, and incidentally, she had been Ty Cobb's, at one point had been romantically attached to Ty Cobb. Ruth was madly in love with her, but he refused to divorce Helen on religious grounds. I'm a Catholic. I can't get a divorce. But when she died, it opened up the opportunity for Ruth and Claire to marry. Claire had a daughter from a previous marriage. And these two daughters were as different as Ruth and Gehrig. And the child by his wife was dressed up in, like a little princess. Meanwhile, the child from the adopted daughter was basically a tomboy. And Mrs. Gehrig, Christina Gehrig, Lou's mom, who was if you look in the dictionary for Little League mom or anything like that, it should show Christina Gehrig's picture, because she was just overbearing. She even went to spring training several years in a row with Lou early on. Anyway, she thought that Claire was a bad mom to the little girl and had no reluctance in speaking up about this and telling anybody she saw about this. Christina Gehrig was like Mrs. Lou Gehrig at that time, because there was a new Mrs. Gehrig, but she would go to all the games. She would sit in the wives section, and she started talking about this and gossiping about Claire and how she dressed her daughters and how she favored her biological daughter over the Ruth's adopted daughter. And Claire exploded, goes to Babe and says, I'm being talked about by, of all people, Lou's mom. Can you do something about this? Babe confronts Lou in the clubhouse. And according to one set of stories that came out of this, there were fisticuffs, and they had to be separated. And the relationship just went south, and that was in the early 30s.
Wow.
And this is what prompted all of this, and then there was more beyond this. And even in some of the highlight reels that you would see in theaters, no one paid much attention to this, but before the feud, you'd see in these highlights that would come on, I think they did them twice a week. You'd see Ruth hitting a home run, coming and crossing home plate, and there's Gehrig, who batted cleanup right behind him, shaking his hand. And or if Ruth was on base and Gehrig had hit the home run, you'd see Ruth waiting for Gehrig. The two would shake hands and go to the dugout together, in a celebratory fashion. But what happened after the feud, if you look at these closely and study them, you'll see that if Ruth hit a home run, circled the bases, Gehrig was not there to shake his hand, or if he was there with his back turned, and Lou didn't offer a handshake. Babe didn't expect one and went to the dugout. There's some little things like this. And what killed it all was after the 1934 season. Of course, it didn't matter because after 1934, Babe was no longer with the Yankees in the next season. But in 1934, after that season, Gehrig, his wife, Babe and his wife, and a bunch of other major league players went to Japan for a barnstorming tour. And on the Empress, the ocean liner, the Japanese Empress, I think was the name of it, there was an incident where Lou was looking for his wife. She was nowhere to be found. She disappeared for several hours, and Lou finally tracks her down, and she's in the Ruth stateroom. And Ruth and she are in there talking. Gehrig gets the wrong impression, and it made that Japanese barnstorming trip miserable.
We'll get to that a little later on. Tony Castro, boy, he loves it. Gehrig and the Babe, the friendship and the feud. Let's do the personalities. When Gehrig gets to the Yankees in 25, and Wally Pip. Ruth is a big star. This is not obviously he, was hitting home runs. He had won a championship. He was huge. He saved baseball the whole bit. And here's Gehrig, a young kid from Columbia, Upper East Side, went to Columbia, played in Hartford, quiet, a big New York accent, a mama's boy, and he joins this great Yankee caravan, and Ruth dominates. Did Ruth handle that properly? Did he take Gehrig under his wing? How about when Gehrig first got to the Yankees in the mid-20s and Ruth the star, how did they get along then?
They got along well. It actually began in 1923, the first year that Yankee Stadium was in existence. The Yankees had done so well in the Polo Grounds that the Giants wanted them out of there. And so they built Yankee Stadium. 23 is the first year. And it was a traumatic experience for Ruth and some of the other hitters because the stadium, as huge as it was even bigger than the stadium, say, in the 50s, which they brought in a little bit, though not much. But the original stadium just dwarfed the old Polo Grounds, which had fences that were just a little longer than Little League fences are today to right and left. And in early 23, Ruth's homer production was off. A lot of his home runs, it would have been home runs in the old Polo Grounds, were going for fly ball out. And so on a particular day there, I think it was in early June or late May, he's taking batting practice, extra batting practice. And so if Ruth's taking extra batting practice, the entire team is taking extra batting practice before the game. Here come Miller Huggins, the manager, with his new signee, Lou Gehrig, and he wants Lou to come in and hit some balls. So it was a scene like out of the natural, where Lou is there. He picks up a bat. The only bat that's there is this bat that turns out to be Babe's, and the teammates are looking at Babe, and Babe doesn't say anything. He lets Lou go ahead and take some swings. The first couple of cuts are not successful, and then they become like this Roy Hobbs thing, several balls out into the right field bleachers, as it were. And Ruth is laughing about this, and then he's already met him earlier, and he continues the whole thing, carrying on, calling him kid, the way Ruth called everybody kid, because he had a difficult time remembering people's names. So they had hit it off well. And at one point, I think in that 1923 anecdote, somebody overheard Ruth saying something to him like Buster, and they thought that this was Lou's nickname. And so for a number of sports writers, the early references to Lou Gehrig was as Buster Gehrig.
Mm.
And, of course, that wasn't his nickname. No telling what the Babe was saying. And so Lou goes to the minors. He comes up in 25. The Yankees are set in their ways. There wasn't a place for him in the starting lineup, and it wasn't until this headache heard round the world, as it's been called by many, which it's debatable as to whether that was really what took place. Whether there was a headache from having been beamed then or being beamed earlier. Gehrig comes in, and the streak actually began the day before when Gehrig had pinch hit. So he comes in this game in 1925, plays well, and holds on to first base. He becomes the Yankees' first baseman from then on.
Yeah, so again, a little frickin' frack. Now, Gehrig was overshadowed a lot by Ruth, especially that third year for him in 27. He had an incredible year. He had 47 homers, but Ruth hit 60. They both had about 40 homers going into the last month of the season. I think Ruth may have been, he had 40, and I think Gehrig maybe had a couple more. Anyway, to make a long story short, that became Babe's year, and everybody kind of forget how good Gehrig was. Did that bother Gehrig? Did being overshadowed by Ruth the early part of his Yankee career, did that bother Gehrig down deep?
They had different DNAs as star athletes. Gehrig wasn't out to be Babe Ruth. I don't think he was ever referred to as the next Babe Ruth, and he didn't. Nothing I could find would suggest that he was in a competition for headlines or anything else with the Babe. And Ruth, we don't realize today just how big Babe Ruth was at that time. He wasn't just a baseball hero. He was a Christ. He was a Messiah. He was someone bigger than life. He was, I can't find of anybody else to compare him to except maybe Muhammad Ali back in his heyday. And so no one was going to take the headlines from Lou Gehrig but from Babe Ruth, and that included Lou, who was happy to be in that in those shadows.
Right, and then of course later on they have the issues, but it seemed to bother Gehrig. He was up or on deck when Ruth made out, stealing second base, trying to, in Game 7 of the 26th World Series with Grover Cleveland Alexander. Made the last out. Cardinals beat the Yankees 3-2. And you hint at the fact that later on, that seemed to bother Gehrig, that he took that at bat away, making the last out of the World Series, trying to steal a base. How about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, that's not what you would expect him to do. And Babe could do things like that. But again, there are differences in their DNAs. Gehrig took a great deal of pride in his consecutive game playing streak.
Right.
And Babe didn't. Babe thought, I guess it amounted to perfect attendance at school or perfect attendance at work. And he often said to Lou, take a few days off, you'll feel better. And that wasn't to be the case. And so in this instance, Babe stealing second base is crazy. Babe's explanation later was that he was trying to take advantage of who was the pitcher then?
Grover Cleveland Alexander, I believe, pitched that game.
Yeah, that he had some issues of his own, off the field issues of his own, and he thought he could shake him up and steal second base and get in scoring position.
And he got
you look upon it, and it's just as easy to figure stay where you are and let Lou hit a home run. Maybe that's as big a possibility as you stealing second base.
Absolutely, and of course, Griever, was dizzy. He was an epileptic. He drank, so that's where Ruth is talking about. All right, Gehrig's mother. We know Ruth, father, mother, terrible childhood, orphanage. The world knows the Ruth story. I mean. And you make the points here many a time in this book that probably contributed to his nuttiness in his life, where he was never satiated with women. I mean, he had to have a million women left and right, even with Claire. Drinking, and it triggers his childhood. And Gehrig's got this mother of his. The father's sickly, drinks, but he's got this mother of his who's just absolutely impossible. You never want a mother like this. Smothers him left and right. He's got a love affair with his mother, but the mother does not allow him to jump off and live a life. Let's do the Gehrig-mom relationship for a sec, Tony. Go ahead.
It was difficult, and she ruined his romantic relationships before Eleanor. There were several, and she ruined all of them. She was always there in the middle, hovering over them and getting in the way, and the women left. And she tried to do the same thing with Eleanor, even after they were engaged. And Eleanor, what finally put the quietus on that relationship and the way Christina had control over Lou was that Eleanor left the house, because before they were to marry, they were living under the same roof with his father and mother, and the mom just mistreated Eleanor to no end, and was trying to dictate how their apartment that they had just rented and would be moving into, how this should be decorated. And Eleanor objected to her interference, broke down crying, left, and when Lou tracked her down, it was effectively choose your mom or me, and Lou chose her.
Major issue there, and so as a result, here's what Christina Garrick says: "He's the only egg I have in my basket. He's the only one of four who lived. She had three other kids who died. So I want to have him the best. So that triggers this relationship. That Garrick siblings all died."
Yes, and also her relationship with the youngest Ruth daughter, the one that was at the center of causing the friction and breaking the friendship apart, was partly attributed to that. This was her little girl, and this little girl, Dorothy, often spent the night and the weekends with Christina Garrick at their home. And she would pack up her own bag, take it over to the Garricks, and then unpack it. And Christina there saw that in her suitcase she didn't have any frilly dresses, and assumed the worst, that she wasn't getting any of these. Well, the situation was that Claire was buying her these frilly dresses and girly things. They just didn't appeal to Dorothy. And so when she would pack her bag to go overnight to the Garricks, she wouldn't pack these things. She'd pack her play clothes.
And Christina couldn't keep her mouth shut, and that caused trouble. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she couldn't keep her mouth shut at any time. And that was, that created problems with between Lou and the women he was dating. That created problems eventually ultimately between Lou and Garrick and Babe.
Tony Castro, great book, Garrick and the Babe, The Friendship and the Feud. You have a great quote in here by Tony Lazzari. Push him up, Tony Lazzari, Hall of Fame second baseman, talking about the two of them. They did not get along. Lou thought Ruth was a big mouth, and Ruth thought Garrick was cheap. They were both right. That is a tremendous quote. We know Ruth is loud. We didn't know Lou was so cheap. Tell them the story about the newspaper guy with the nickel with the tip. That was fascinating.
Oh God, I've almost forgotten it. But there was an incident where by this time he's married and living in their apartment, and somebody brings something to their door, and Lou doesn't have any immediate change, and doesn't bother to get any from Eleanor or look for any. He winds up giving him just a few cents from pocket change as a tip, and even then, that was hardly anything. And this got around, and he was as bad as that. And somebody using the same anecdote was telling me that they'd heard stories about Lou just being a bad tipper. And as we know, you can't be a star, especially in a big town like New York, and be a bad tipper.
No, you can't be. That's a negative. Everybody's going to know it. They all want a big tip, and if you're a bad tipper, that reputation follows you for a long time, does it? And Ruth is a guy who throws away $100 bills like they're going out of style. So that's why people love Ruth, and that's why people don't like Garrick for a long period of time. You know that?
Well, Ruth gets comped on a lot of things: meals, drinks, clothing, but he always tipped. That was the difference. He tipped on even when he wasn't charged, and Lou didn't. Whether they were raised differently, it's hard to say. But Lou was very tight with his money, and that came out even in when Lou got sick. Interestingly enough, I had a signing here in Los Angeles last Thursday, and it went well. The number of people there, a lot of books sold. And we're having a great time. And at some point, this one lady who I didn't know gets up, and she becomes, I've been to comedy shows where there are hecklers. We all are familiar with this. she was a heckler at my book signing. she was upset at the way I had characterized Lou and his mom, and an incident involving Lou after he became sick. And she wanted, I can't believe you did this, your sources on this. And I said, my sources were A, B, and C on this. And I wasn't the first one to reference these things. And she was livid. But
Wow.
anyway, this, what it involved was in 1939, when, we all are familiar with July 4th, 1939, Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day, when Lou makes the, luckiest man on the face of the earth, face of the world, whatever speech, and it's become like our Gettysburg Address of baseball and sports. Great. But there was a story behind that, and that is, we look back upon this, and we see a man that the stadium was honoring a man who was dying. But nothing could be further from the truth. No one knew he was dying at that time. If you go back and read the newspaper accounts prior to that, that's not the way this came down. And the sadness about it was that here's this great baseball hero in New York, and a New Yorker, who is having to retire because of an illness. But the way the illness was described originally was, I think the Mayo Clinic, the Yankees, and Lou Gehrig all said it was the consequences of chronic infantile paralysis. And they said nothing about ALS. They said that, with some therapy, Lou would be fine and be able to live a normal life, but he wouldn't be able to play baseball. This was important to Lou, and he orchestrated this deception, as it were. And he orchestrated it because he didn't make as much money as Ruth, far from it, but he had as big of a nut every month. He was taking care of not only his expenses and his wife's, but those of his mom and his father. And his mom loved to shop. They had a house of their own, which incidentally they went into receivership later. So Lou was living a nice life, a comfortable life, but he also needed a paycheck, and he was hoping to be able to stay on with the Yankees in a front office position, an executive position in the coming years. And he needed to be healthy for that, at least be able to get around. And so this story came out from the Mayo Clinic, where he had gone to be diagnosed, and from the Yankees and from Lou. And the true diagnosis, though, remained hidden. This ALS that later took on the name of, the Lou Gehrig disease, never came out until late in the season, after, long weeks after this
July 4th, right.
Tribute. Yeah, the July 4th tribute to Gehrig. Several Yankee players became sick. They were complaining of muscle cramps and problems with their with different parts of their bodies related to muscles. And there was this Daily News reporter at that time by the name of I want to say Jimmy Powers, I believe was his name.
Right.
He was with Daily News,
Famous.
and he wrote. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he was famous. Go ahead. Yes, I know him. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm thinking that's who it was. Wrote a story questioning whether Gehrig had, I'm looking at this now in the book, had infected his teammates with the polio germ that supposedly had ravaged his own body. Because, infantile paralysis is polio. When I was growing up, even in the 50s before the Salk vaccine, if you knew somebody had polio, no matter how you felt about them, your parents just kept you away from them because it was communicable. And so he wrote a story suggesting that Gehrig might have infected his teammates. Gehrig blows up and sues the Daily News. And he probably, in retrospect, wished he hadn't, because it led to a number of other things, including a lawyer for the Daily News going to the Mayo Clinic, doing an investigation there, and finding that the Mayo Clinic doctors, who were being subpoenaed and all, they had no choice but to reveal the actual diagnosis, which wasn't chronic
That was ALS. Well, so Gehrig knew he had ALS, but told everybody, from July to August or July to September, I'll be okay. I want to stay with, he wants the 50th grand that the Yankees are paying him. And then the Yankees think that he's infecting them. And then that's when the Daily News writes it. And then they has a lawsuit. And we find out that Gehrig knew in July that he was dying. That's basically the point. Wow.
Yeah.
Now, the Gehrig with the Gehrig wife. Now, you mentioned Claire was with Ty Cobb, so forget that. But Eleanor Gehrig, she is no angel either. I mean, grew up in Chicago and everything else. Do we believe, it's always been rumored, do we believe that something was going on in that stateroom with Eleanor Gehrig and the babe that may have fractured this relationship? Or is that just a platonic get-together over a couple of drinks and Lou's imagination took it too far? Which one is it?
I myself was able to find anything that suggested that there had been a relationship between the two of them. But there was one Gehrig biography that I can't recall just off the top of my head. I quoted in the book. I cited in the book. And the author there says, effectively, the Babe didn't have any platonic relationships. So if he had known Eleanor, not only then, but before Gehrig became involved with her, it must have been that he had, quote, known her. So I don't know, to answer your question, I myself didn't independently confirm that or find that there had been any relationship between Mrs. Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth.
Right.
Maybe there was. I wouldn't go there.
You wouldn't go there. All right. So so basically the issue for the two of them, again, as Lazzeri said, Gehrig's cheap, Babe's loud, number one. Number two, Babe makes fun of his streak a lot, which probably bothers Lou to no end about, take a couple days off for crying out loud. That's number two. And then, Ruth quits. Gehrig tries to get the team going. They need DiMaggio in 36. So there's a lot of things Gehrig doesn't like. He's overshadowed his whole career. Babe finally leaves, and he still can't win a championship, and here comes DiMaggio. So there might be a little jealousy as far as Lou is concerned with the fact he never really can say that it's his team, correct?
No. I mean, they thought it was going to be his team, and it didn't work out that way. Like you hit the nail on the head there. DiMaggio comes in 36, and when he finally gets into the lineup, because he suffered a real bizarre injury and missed the first few weeks of that season. So once he gets in there and starts hitting and being DiMaggio, it's his team.
Yeah, fast. All right. Now, let's do quickly Tony Castro, the Gehrig and the Babe. We'll wrap it up with this. On Lou Gehrig Day, then his death. Now, they did not talk for the 5 years prior to Lou Gehrig Day, and then Babe shows up with that white blazer. Is that correct?
That's correct. He shows up. He decided to go early that morning. He wasn't going to go. Claire was involved in this. She still hadn't forgiven Mrs. Christina Gehrig, and he and Babe had other plans. At the last minute, Babe says, he's my friend. I'm going. And he's wearing that cream-colored suit that's become, famous. And if you look at the rest of the pictures and everything that took place there, they had the 1927 Yankees there honoring Lou, and they're all in uniform. The ones that are alive are in uniform, except for Babe, because he did this at the last minute. They didn't expect him to be there, and voila.
And then he gives him a hug. And he hadn't talked to him in five.
A big hug.
Go ahead.
It was a bizarre incident, and the whole thing leading up to it. It began not as an appreciation day. It became with the players wanting to honor the teammates from that 39 team, wanting to honor their teammate, and they had New York's baseball writer write up something special, which they put on a plaque, and they were going to give it to us. The management heard about this and said, no, we're going to do something more about this. So the first thought was that let's honor Lou at the All-Star game that's going to be played here this summer. And so they were going to do that, and then the Yankees being, the Yankees said, we can make more money, not by sharing the proceeds from that day with all of baseball, but let's do a special day for Lou on the 4th of July. And that way we get all the proceeds of these 57,000 plus people that are going to come into Yankee Stadium for this. So that's when they decided to do this. This appreciation for Gehrig had gotten out of hand. He didn't want it. He had written a few words on a sheet of paper, and then when he got there that day, he didn't want to speak. And it's an old story. He didn't want to speak, and he was reluctant to come forward. And finally, I guess it was the
Bill
manager,
or Bill Dickey, one of them. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, or Bill Dickey, his friend, came forward and said, "You're going to have to speak," because people were chanting "Lou, Lou, Lou," and so he came forth, and he obviously had this in his head, but and no one can go there and figure out exactly what he might have thought. And as far as I've been able to find, there was nothing to. No one later interviewed him about this and said, "What was going through your head?" We just have his words to go, and they were marvelous words.
Right, and then Ruth didn't see him until he never saw him again. Right? I mean, he showed up at his house after he died. But Ruth, between 39 and
after he died, and Eleanor was upset about that, and because he hadn't been around.
Yeah, and he showed up drunk, did he not? He was bombed when he showed up the day he died.
The story was that he and Claire both were. They both loved to have a good time.
Very strange.
I mean, this was not some biblical story, or at least a biblical story like what we're taught at Sunday school. It was either of these two couples, either with Ruth and Claire, or Gehrig, and certainly not with the Gehrig mom, with Christina Gehrig, or with Eleanor.
Right. So Ruth doesn't see him. He shows up at the Yankee Day, which is good for him. He gives him a big hug, famous scene. You got that in the front page of your book. That's good. And then he disappears. We don't see Ruth for a long time. And then he finds out he dies, and he shows up in your show at 1 o'clock in the morning, half in the bag. I mean, that's not the way. I mean, is that the way to do it? If you're Babe Ruth with the wife, that's I don't blame him.
I'm emotional about this. And, the opening scene in the book, the prologue, goes into this. And Johnny Grant, who was the so-called mayor of Hollywood up until his death in 2008, Johnny Grant was this showman who looked like a miniature. Well, he was, I was going to say a miniature Mickey Rooney, but that's pretty small. I mean, he looked like Mickey Rooney. He passed for Mickey Rooney early on. He became famous in his own right. He befriended Babe Ruth in 1942 during the making of Pride of the Yankees, and I knew Johnny since the late 70s when I came to Los Angeles, and in 2006 or so they were honoring Johnny, and he wants somebody to put together his portfolio and do a brief biography of him. And he hired me to do it, and that's when I'm going through all these pictures, and I'd never seen a picture of him with Babe Ruth. And I'm, Johnny, what are you doing with Babe Ruth? And he tells me the story, and he starts telling me the story of how he and Babe became friends, and how Babe had befriended him, and he took him under his wing. And here's this little guy who, at the time in '42, Johnny was barely had his feet wet in Los Angeles and in Hollywood. But Babe Ruth was his best friend, and they had several soul-wrenching conversations in which he told me the story that's there in the prologue about Babe just in tears, feeling that somehow he never told Lou how much he loved him, how much he meant to him, and that his good friend Lou had gone to the grave without him talking to him. In those years.
Wow.
From roughly 4 or 5 years.
From the mid-30s until one last thing, Tony. The book, Babe is just, I can see why Gehrig is tough to get into, tough to embrace. He's stiff. I mean, he's a great player, and he turns out to be, very common, which you like. But Ruth he's got so much personality. And he's so fun. And now he's fun in the wrong ways. And he has he's terrible as a bad husband. I mean, the whole bit. Not a great father, the whole 9 yards. But as far as just hanging around him, the room was alive with Ruth. The room is never alive with Garrick. So and he's perfect for the 1920s. So this book gives you the feel that it's Babe everything. Garrick is a sidebar. It's Babe everything, correct?
I had a difficult time getting into Garrick, especially researching it and then sitting down and writing. And what helped me out, although it was a terrible way to be helped out, in the last few months before finishing the book, I found out that a long-time friend of mine, she'd been my date at my senior prom in high school. She'd been diagnosed with ALS, and it just tore me apart. Talking to her family, talking to her as she was wasting away, and seeing what was happening there, and it was like visiting Lou Gehrig in a different way. It was like visiting Lou Gehrig, and then I could get into it, and it was like, wow, between tears and just feeling like, God, why did it take this for me to be so moved about what Gehrig was going through?
Yeah, a lot like Jim Valvano in a lot of ways. Garrick, Valvano, the way he handled his death puts him on a high level, and the way Garrick handled his puts him on this high esteem level. Don't you agree?
Exactly. Just like Mantle in that last month or so.
Good point. Yeah, with
out he was dying in 95. The way Mantle handled that thing, there was a few days after Mantle died, there was a cartoon, an editorial cartoon of Mantle with St. Peter at the pearly gates, and St. Peter has his arm around Mickey, and he's saying something like, Mick, the way you handled that last inning was your greatest part or your greatest hit or something like that. And it was so true, the way these men, I hadn't thought about it until you just pointed it out, Mantle, Jim Valvano, and now writing about Gehrig. I mean, you just have to, hopefully if we're ever presented with that type of situation, we have the same grace and courage and strength to behave in a similar manner.
Great job, Tony, with the book. Really enjoyed it. Hopefully the audience will pick this up. The Garrick and the Babe, Friendship and the Feud. Keep up the good work. I'll get the next one you write on DiMaggio, on Man, whatever you write on. Is it DiMaggio? DiMaggio. All right, the next.
It's DiMaggio, yes.
I'll read that. We'll get you on again. Thanks for a few minutes. Keep up the good work. Appreciate it.
Okay, you too.
You got it. Tony Castro on that great Garrick Ruth book. We continue here on Mando Gun.